Welcome to VCR, Vintage Cinema Rewind. We're bringing old movies to new viewers. I'm Blake.
And I need some new shoes.
Good.
They're looking pretty bad. And they smell like my feet.
Some high-quality shoes or some low-quality shoes?
Some shoes with cardboard soles that are bad.
And if you don't know what that is the intro to High and Low, essentially.
High and low, Aiden.
Just exactly how it starts, with a man complaining about his smelly cardboard shoes.
You know what? I have to admit, and this is jumping ahead a bit, I actually liked the first 20 minutes of this movie a lot more than I thought I would. Like, when they're, when the main character is arguing about shoe qualities, I was kind of, like, inching forward. Like, this is kind of compelling. Like, this is a man with principles.
I was kind of a little bit more mixed on it maybe, but we'll get into it when we get into our deep dive, because this is the spoiler-free premiere episode for High and Low from 1963, I believe.
From Akira Kurosawa, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Japanese director.
Yeah, he's obviously, like you said, one of the greats of all time.
Mm-hmm. He's goated.
Yes, his films have been nominated for plenty of awards, been, you know, rated highly for the past 60, 70, 80 years.
Yeah, and we are deciding to take a stab at him. Although, wait, you and Jason already did a Kurosawa movie.
We did a Kobayashi movie.
Ah, my mistake.
Yes, one of his main, I guess, competitors, if you look at it that way, in the Japanese cinematic world.
So you did a Pepsi movie, and now we're doing a Coke movie.
Yes, that is basically it. Although, I guess depending on which one you like better, I don't know. I've only seen one of each of their movies at this point, but...
Well, Pepsi is disgusting, if you want my opinion, so...
So how dare you talk about Kobayashi that way, then?
You're right. I'm sorry. Am I? I kind of lost the thread here, but anyways.
Have you ever seen a Kobayashi movie?
I don't think so. I listened to you and Jason's episode.
Yeah.
Mostly just so I could, like, scoff and roll my eyes and... You know, be like, ugh, I wish they could have invited Michael on, but...
Listen to these opinions that are held.
Actually, you know what? This is so random. I listened to that on my 30th birthday.
Yep.
I don't know how I remember that, but it was my 30th birthday, and I was listening to you and Jason just badgering on about this movie I'd never heard of.
Called Harakiri.
Harakiri.
Which is a really, really good movie, and I'm planning on revisiting it. In the near future.
For our top 100 list, which is coming up in the next few months.
Which is coming up very quickly,
So mark your calendars. I'm talking to myself. Michael, mark your calendar.
Yeah.
This is coming up really fast. I should say I have started working on my list.
So have I.
Good.
Without spoiling too much, do you think this one has a chance of ending up in the top 100?
No.
Okay, very definitive.
Maybe the top 200, but not the top 100. Well, We'll see, but probably not.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, maybe I'm a little bit higher on it than you.
So I should say that for our listeners at home, we broke a cardinal rule of this podcast in that we actually watched this movie together a couple nights ago, which, again, normally we go off independently. We watch the movies and then we convene, but we actually decided to watch this movie together. And we talked about it just a teeny tiny bit before we started recording. And I think what we've arrived at is that I might be a little more conflicted about this movie than Blake is.
Yes.
So take that with what you will. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, should we get into the spoiler-free plot of this movie?
Yes, let's do that. So... Toshiro Mifune plays Kingo Gondo, a man who is very, very, very passionate about shoes.
Yes.
We open to a tense meeting with him and three other businessmen at this national shoes company, and basically there's this big power struggle going on behind the scenes where these men want Kingo to join them so that they can oust the executive director or the president from the throne and take over the company and make, they basically want to peddle these inferior products to make more money. Mm-hmm. But Kingo, again, is almost suicidally passionate about shoes. And, he has principles, basically. And he doesn't want to flood the market with this inferior product.
Yeah.
So he refuses their offer and they storm off in a huff. He then reveals to his wife and assistant that he has essentially begged, borrowed, and stealed and mortgaged his entire life so that he can buy more stock in this company.
Yes.
And it turns out he's like, I don't know what the term for that would be, like the executive shareholder or something.
He's planning on essentially doing a hostile takeover of the business. Like, he's trying to acquire enough votes that he can take over the business right out from under these guys. He's kind of 2 steps ahead of them in terms of acquiring the business.
And then, as it happens, like right after that, I should mention that everything I'm explaining happens within the first scene, which it comprises like the first 20 minutes of this movie.
Yeah.
Right? Then it turns out that Kingo's son has been kidnapped, and the kidnappers have demands. But then it turns out that they actually kidnapped his son's best friend.
Yes.
So therein lies the central conflict of the movie. Kingo obviously doesn't want his son's best friend to be murdered or killed, but he is also, like, he's a very rich man who has basically, he's gambling everything he owns so that he can stage this hostile takeover of the company, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if he pays the 5 million yen or whatever it is for his son's snot-nosed little friend, then he's basically broke and destitute.
Yeah.
Right? And therein lies the conflict of the movie.
Yeah, and it's kind of an interesting conflict in the sense that, you know, like, it's heavily... The first act of this movie is very revolving around the fact of, like, you know, what is the right decision here? And for most of people would say, well, you should pay out the ransom.
Right.
But it gets a little murkier in this movie, right? Like, the decisions.
I have to admit, like, I actually found Kingo very compelling as a main character, despite his obvious foot fetish. And like, I was kind of thinking about it, and I'm like, yeah, what would you do? Because if it's your kid, then like, yeah, obviously you would do whatever it took to get your kid back. But if it's your kid's best friend,
right,
and you've mortgaged everything you own, like, you know, Kingo goes back and forth 2 or 3 times in the first hour of this movie being like, I'm not paying. Okay, I'll pay. I'm not paying. All right, I'll pay.
Yeah.
And then, you know, the police do get involved, and he's kind of asking them, like, what are the chances you can get me my money back if I pay the ransom? And they're kind of just like,
yeah.
Like, like, I mean, we'll try our best, dude. Like, yeah. So anyways, and then he even's like, well, they're probably not going to harm the kid. And they're like, I don't know, man. Like, he sounds kind of deranged.
Yeah.
So anyways.
Yeah, so that's really the first act of the movie, is the central conflict of what would you do in this situation. And to the credit of this movie, it's written in a way that it's not black and white. Like, there's so much conflict going on that you as a viewer really feel and have to work out in your own head, like, what you would do in the situation, or what is the right move, or how would you approach this situation, right?
Yeah, it's such an interesting, like, they should almost show this movie in like ethics classes, because it's like, what would you do, right? Like,
right.
Like, if you got a random phone call and some like jabbering lunatic was like, if you don't fork over everything you own, we're gonna kill this kid, and you just be like, I don't know this kid, like,
right.
Like,
right,
what am I supposed to do?
Well, and the other part of it too is that the setup of the movie is around Gondo as a character, and his motivations are all made very clear, and that impacts all of the conundrum of the first act of the movie, right?
Right. And like, you know, and you're right, like, there's even, so his poor long-suffering wife is very much like, you know, you need to pay the ransom and we need to get that little boy back.
Right.
And his wife at one point is kind of like, you know, who cares about money? And he's like, what do you mean who cares about money? He's like, you grew up rich.
Yeah.
You've never not had luxury. You mean to tell me you'd survive if we were suddenly broke?
Right.
And it's kind of like, fuck, he's got a point.
Yep.
Like, you know, I think he even says, like, I'll survive, you won't survive.
Right.
So, you know, there's that to consider.
Yeah, there's a lot in the first act that's really compelling. Like, this is one of those, like, the first act is incredibly strong.
Yeah.
And then interesting, without getting into too much spoilers, the second act does devolve more into a police procedural. And it kind of, like, you and I both said after watching this movie that there's kind of a Full Metal Jacket syndrome to this movie.
Yeah, it's 2 movies stitched together.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I guess your mileage is going to vary on whether the second act works. I think there's some jank, and I think that's part of.
I have to, like, cards on the table. I caught myself checking out during the second act.
Yeah, and
whereas I will say the first act is like the first hour, and I was riveted.
Yeah,
you know, like all the different all the different ways the kidnapper tortures them, all the different angles the kidnapper has considered. Right? There's a moment towards the end of the first act when they think they have the upper hand on this guy, and then they realize, oh fuck, like he is like 3 steps ahead of us. Like we're not gonna catch him.
Right.
Yeah,
it's really compelling stuff, like really exciting. And then I guess if I'm gonna get a little bit ahead here into like who this movie is for, like I think that there is kind of that Full Metal Jacket syndrome, like second act jank, or kind of like the story kind of pivots a bit, and for that first like 20 minutes after that pivot, you do kind of feel out of it because
you feel a little discombobulated.
Yeah, because the central conflict that has been so compelling for the first act of the movie is kind of dissipates.
Essentially, yeah. And like I think you eventually found your footing, but I don't know that I did.
Right.
I think I was kind of like you landed in a graceful crouch and I landed on my face.
Well, and I think maybe surprisingly, I think I've actually seen more Japanese movies than you have.
I've seen more anime than you.
You have seen more anime than I have, but Japanese movies, I've watched probably half a dozen at this point, or a dozen.
Okay.
And that's something that I've actually come to notice in Japanese movie is there's kind of like a
different storytelling tradition.
There's like a competency porn to some of the movies where it's like, let's watch a bunch of competent people like devise a plot, and navigate a situation. Like Shin Godzilla is like a really solid example of that, where the whole movie is just like, how is the government going to respond to this situation? And literally it's all about competency and a bunch of people reacting to something.
I think, and this is slightly spoiling my opinion for the spoiler section, I think what bothered me about the second act is that Kingo, who's essentially our main character, sort of gets left behind.
Yes.
And I mean, and like as someone who does write stories, like I can understand that sometimes like logic dictates that your story has to go a certain way.
Right.
Like Kingo's a shoe salesman who's constantly like licking women's feet. Like I'm
Jesus.
I might leave that in. I don't care. But like no, but like, you know, Kingo is obviously an intelligent guy. He's obviously like determined. He's a big risk taker. He's a phenomenal entrepreneur.
Yep.
But he's not a detective.
Right.
Like, what are we going to do? Are we going to spend the second hour following this guy around as he investigates?
Yeah.
Right? Unfortunately, no. We get stuck with the police characters who we do know, but who are all significantly less interesting than Kingo is.
Yeah, they're police and they're officers, and there's no like interesting like backstory to any of them. They're just like they're doing their 9-to-5 job.
Yeah,
basically.
like maybe if there had been like a really compelling like side character, like detective, like a Tommy Lee Jones type who's like smoking a cigarette, be like,
right,
you know, my dad was in a similar situation where he lost everything and then, you know, blah 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 blah. But we don't really get that.
Right.
There's just like 4 or 5 guys who are more or less interchangeable from each other, except for the bald one, and we just kind of follow them around.
I guess maybe why I liked it more than you is like I do really appreciate a movie that gets into like competent people do like navigating a situation, like I solving a puzzle.
I do too, and like to be fair, like I think that's a universal storytelling tradition is that we like competent people solving complicated problems, right?
Yeah.
I just felt that maybe the emotional stakes were lacking in the second hour.
Yeah, and that's completely valid. I think we're already into who this movie is for in depth enough to just get full into that, and maybe we'll circle back to characters and people you may know after. But
sure.
I think that the other thing to kind of know about this movie going in is that this movie is like really influential to this type of genre, like the police procedural genre. And if you've ever seen the movie like Seven or Zodiac or any of those kind of David Fincher films, like you're going to feel relatively at ease in this film, which is like, those are some of my favorite movies of all time. David Fincher is one of my favorite directors of all time.
He's a cool dude.
Yeah.
He made Alien 3. Don't remind him of that.
Jesus. And even like, I think at one point you said that there was something in that movie that made you think of Batman and the Batman while we were watching it.
Basically, yeah.
And that's actually like, you weren't seeing something, like, or not seeing something there. I don't know how to say that.
I know what you meant.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, there's something there.
There's definitely something there, right? Because, and it even notes like that Matt Reeves is a huge Kurosawa fan, and he actually said that they designed some of the set pieces of the Batman to mirror the kind of more dingy parts of High and Low.
Interesting. I could definitely see that, actually.
Yeah. So there's like, on the police procedural side of things, there's a lot of influence that this movie has on some of the great movies of the last 20, 30 years. In addition to that, like Bong Joon-ho, who's a very, very famous Korean filmmaker, he released in 2019 the movie Parasite, which actually won the Best Picture that year at the Oscars.
I remember. I was there.
And, you know, like watching this and having seen Parasite, like, there's very clear, like,
there's almost a
influences.
Parasitic relationship.
Jesus. All right, you're in a mood today.
No, this is me in a good mood, Blake.
You're just Bit City over here.
Hey.
Oh man. Yeah, no, I think there's like the obvious reference points, right? Like those movies, if you like any of them and like the aspects of a police procedural, or you like the aspect of the class story from Parasite, like there's so many ideas from this film that are clearly influences on those other movies.
I do want to say, like, before everybody comes at me, I don't think this is a bad movie at all. I just don't really think it was for me.
Yeah, and I'm actually, having watched it and even watched it with you, like I kind of felt that too, like especially in that shift in the second act. I was like, oh, this doesn't really feel like a Michael movie anymore.
Yeah, you felt my soul leave my body. Yeah.
I also saw you checking your phone too.
Yeah,
so.
well, that's a good sign. I will say, though, what I did admire the most about this movie is just the staging and the framing and the cinematography. I don't know that I've ever said that about a movie before.
I don't think either of us have said that about any of the movies we've covered.
Like, it's remarkable that, like, most of this movie is just dudes in rooms yelling at each other.
Yeah.
But, like, the way the camera moves and, like, frames certain things is just gorgeous.
Yeah, I mean, there's times when the camera almost doesn't move for, like, upwards of, like, 10 minutes at a time.
Right.
And there will be 10 people in the view of the camera, and each one of them will be doing their own thing and like interacting with each other. Like, this is a movie that I think would be really rewarding to watch on multiple rewatches, because you can kind of like watch different people and how they're doing different things.
Yeah.
And you know, to me it feels like if you're a fan of the theater, if you like going to see theater plays, like this is a really cool movie because it kind of feels like it's staged almost like a play.
Kind of, yeah. Well, I mean, it's mostly dialogue for long stretches of the
Yeah. I mean,
play.
the first act of the movie, almost the whole first act of the movie takes place in one room.
Pretty much.
And I was kind of like, is this going to be the whole movie? And I was kind of okay with it.
I think we had similar thoughts at similar times. I was like, is this it? And then I was just like, all right.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, there's kind of a moment when you're watching it where you're like, maybe this is just the whole movie. And
yeah,
you're
like how quaint.
Yeah, I'm enjoying it though. I'm here. I'm on the ride. I'm enjoying it. But anyway, I think that, you know, for the most part, this movie does hold up really well. And there are people like you who are just not going to be down for that shift in the second act. But for me, like, I thought this movie was amazing and it held up really, really well, like shockingly well, because even like there's some commentary on classism in this movie.
There's a bit, yeah.
And, you know, I think that a weaker script, it would have been much harder to empathize at all with Gondo, right? Especially like with the current times. But, you know, this movie, the script is so strong that like you really do feel for Gondo and the conundrum that he's in as a character.
I guess so, right? I mean, there is something to be said for, you know, as writers, we're all about like establishing professional or personal stakes, but it's like, I was kind of like, it was kind of like novel for me watching this. I'm like, what do you do when there is no stakes, you know? Or like when the stakes are complicated, right?
Right.
Yeah. Like, I mean, you know, your child's kidnapped, you have to go save them. Like, that's a tale as old as time. But it's like, what do you do when your best friend's kid or like your kid's best friend gets kidnapped. Like, are you like gonna draw your sword as eagerly, or are you gonna be like, I don't know that this is my fucking problem? Like,
Yeah, well, and especially too, like the circumstances of the movie are, it's like the worst thing to happen at the worst possible time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and even like in that first act too, there's the element of mystery, right? And that's why we picked this movie, is for the mystery element. And there is something compelling here where it's like the whodunit of the first act is also kind of bubbling in the background as well.
Yeah, like who doggone done it, right?
Yeah.
And, there's that great scene early on where, Gondo has this very faithful assistant, but as he's seeing those three treacherous businessmen out, they kind of like present him with a counteroffer, and you see him kind of go, I don't know, right?
Yeah.
So, and again, we're kind of like, oh, it's got to be him, right?
Yeah.
But anyways.
Yeah, no, it's really compelling stuff. Do you think this movie holds up well?
I think pacing wise it does, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it's not really, even the second act, I personally kind of checked out, but I don't think it's badly made or badly paced at all.
Yeah.
I will say, I do need to say that, like, maybe the final 10, 15 minutes, I did kind of chuck my phone out your window and be like, oh, okay, like, this is interesting now. Okay, I'm back. Like,
Yeah.
I do think, in particular, the final scene of this movie is incredibly compelling.
Yes.
Yes.
It very much is. And it almost felt unexpected in a sense, too. Like, you don't really expect it to conclude the way it does.
There is a Batman comparison to be made, and that's all I'll say about it.
Yeah, that's a really great point as well, right? So, characters and people you may know. I mean, this is a movie from 1963 from Japan, so maybe a lot of our listeners don't necessarily know a lot of these actors, but I'll go over a couple of them because they are kind of interesting. Like, obviously, King Ogondo is our main character, the National Shoes executive, who's unfortunately his not son is kidnapped. He's played by Toshiro Mifune, and he actually collaborated with Kurosawa 16 times. Like,
okay, so they got along.
Yeah, and funny enough, he's actually also the main character of Harakiri. The Kobayashi movie that we did. Yeah, so he's one of the greats. He's actually considered one of the greatest actors of all time.
Okay, good for him.
And I think that's also probably part of the strength of the film, right? Is like you have to feel for a character that is a corporate executive, right?
Yeah, not an easy task in 2025.
Yeah, and I still felt for the guy. So otherwise, there's Inspector Tokaru, the lead police officer. He's played by Tetsuya Nakadaya. He's actually more prominent in Kobayashi movies than Kurosawa movies, interestingly enough.
And he's still alive.
Yeah.
Huh.
And I think he made some movies recently as well. Like, obviously he's older, but yeah, no, he was in Harakiri as well. He was the main character of the Human Condition trilogy, which is a 9 or 10 hour movie series that Kobayashi made. That's essentially like one movie that he cut, like almost like Kill Bill, but in 3 because it was 9 hours long.
That's pretty ambitious.
It's considered one of the great movies of all time, and I've never watched it because it's 10 hours long.
What'd you say it was called?
It's called The Human Condition. It's Human Condition Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3. We will do it at some point. I'm not sure exactly when, but I'd really like to watch it because, like I said, Kobayashi... Harakiri is one of the great movies of all time, and I still stand by that. And then Riko Gondo, Kingo's wife, is played by Kyoko Kagawa. I'm struggling here. I'm sorry.
You're doing your best. You're doing your best.
And she actually was a really famous actress in her own right. So this movie is kind of like the who's who of Japanese cinema in the 60s, which is really cool. And if you've watched any of the movies from the 50s through probably late 70s era Japan, which is some of the great movies of all time, a lot of these people are familiar faces. Even Tetsuya Mahashi, who plays Gondo's assistant, he actually had a really strong career after this as well, doing a lot of other Japanese movies. He was also in a Japanese-American war epic called Tora Tora Tora, which sounds like an interesting film. It maybe doesn't hold up super well, but it's a cool collaboration. So he was also a very famous actor. And then obviously rounding things out, this is a Kurosawa movie, and like you said before, Kurosawa is considered one of the great movie directors of all time. And this is my first movie that I've ever seen of his. Have you ever watched a Kurosawa movie?
I did see Rashomon in film school, like probably 14 years ago now. So don't ask me what happened. I don't remember. And that is a joke if you've seen the movie.
Nice. That's funny. I actually haven't seen any one of his other movies before, so this was my first Kurosawa. But he has some other like incredibly important movies. One of them being Seven Samurai, which is basically like every epic movie of the last 60 years has been based off of Seven Samurai.
Yeah, he did it. He defined a genre. Good job.
He literally defined a genre. Like, you have Star Wars. Star Wars has Seven Samurai to thank. Like, pretty much every movie of the last 50 years.
Shit, that's when you know you've made it. When suddenly everyone is just copying you.
Yeah, we need to do Seven Samurai at some point. That's like up there on my need to watch list.
Interesting. I did see The Magnificent Seven, which was like the Western remake from like the 60s or 70s or something with Yul Brynner and Charles Bronson.
Yeah, it's kind of being remade like every X amount of years, like literally for the last like 7 years.
Oh yeah, wasn't there another Magnificent Seven movie like
there was.
recently?
Yeah, there was.
I don't think anybody saw it.
Yeah. He also made Ron, which is from 1985, and it's like an epic that is on Tubi right now. So, Kurosawa movies are kind of everywhere, except for this one, getting a little bit ahead. This movie was really hard to find. Like, it's not available anywhere except for the Criterion collection and on Apple TV, where we rented it.
Is that where we found it? Apple TV?
Yeah.
Shit.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd like to get the Criterion, but we'll have to get rid of some other movie subscriptions, which I'm kind of fine with. There's some garbage ones that I'm kind of sick of.
Yeah, get your shit together, Netflix. Come on.
I wasn't going to say Netflix, but we were all thinking it.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to get sponsored by Netflix anytime soon. That's okay.
Yeah, that's true. So, no, it was really cool. I'm glad that we did this one. Kind of finally scratched my Kurosawa itch, and I can finally say to Jason that you and I have done a Kurosawa, and I'm sure Jason and I, like, who will be coming back to this podcast at some point soon.
At some point soon. You guys remember Jason? He had a kid. He has a good reason to not hang out with us anymore.
Yeah, exactly. So when to watch? What's your ideal viewing experience for this one?
I think we had the ideal viewing experience. Like, it was around like 8 p.m. on a Friday night.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like this on like a Sunday night, maybe ever so slightly more than a Friday night, when I'm a little bit more with it. And
you're a little bit more together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know what I'll say as well? This is a black and white movie. And my ideal viewing experience with a black and white movie is actually like in the darkest room possible, because that's when like the difference like in the blacks and the white I find
all the
come
shadows
alive.
play together.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I got to see Godzilla Minus Color Minus One last year in theaters, and it was such a cool viewing experience getting to see like a black and white movie like that on a big screen.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure that this movie will have kind of those midnight screenings at the indie movie theaters that you locally might visit. So
yeah,
if you do see this one playing, like, maybe go check it out, because it's a pretty good movie.
Go check it out, homie.
Yeah. And that is all I got for the primer episode. So
that is all I got too. I think we have some things to say about this one.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun discussion, I think.
Yeah.
And we finally get to delve into this 2 nights after watching it, and not really talking about it afterwards.
Yeah, we avoided each other.
Pretty much.
For 2 whole days.
For 2 whole days.
Yeah.
Nice. All right, well, tell your dad, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.